Good evening and welcome all to the Asiatic Society for Sarmaya Talks. My name is Komal, and on behalf of the team at Sarmaya Arts Foundation, we're very delighted to have you today evening. A little introduction about ourselves. Our mission at Sarmaya is to make Indian art, culture, and heritage more accessible and inspire young learners to discover their cultural inheritance through a critical and compassionate lens. We work on a hybrid model, serving audiences both online and on the ground. I would like to now introduce our speaker for the evening. Professor Nayanjot Lahiri is a historian, archaeologist, author, and professor of history at the Ashoka University. Among many influential books she has published on ancient Indian history, empires, and archaeology is Ashoka in Ancient India, which won the John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History in 2016 from the American Historical Association. She was also awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities Archaeology for 2013. Professor Lahiri.
So I want to thank Sarmaya, especially Paul Abraham, for this invitation to speak on my new book, Searching for Ashok. It's a book whose genesis I see as being located in the biography I wrote of Emperor Ashok, which was published in 2015 as Ashok in Ancient India. Now, there were many places where I researched that book, riverbanks, rocky ridges, fields, even the Chhatrapati, Vastu Sangralaya, where actually the Supara edicts of Emperor Ashok, the remaining edicts that are there, they're not at Supara, are. This happened across India, but especially in the hills of Karnataka and Andhra, and in a number of Buddhist holy places in North India and in Nepal. So it was in such landscapes that my first book, Ashoka in Ancient India, took shape. While I was traveling and doing that, it also showed me in all those travels that there was an intertwining of history and, that is the life of Ashok and his memory in many of those places. So when I began this book, which is about how he was remembered and forgotten across the centuries, I actually found myself going back to those very places in order to understand how memories of him had been shaped over time. And later, I followed his different avatars in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, and in Thailand. So, searching for Ashok is actually an outcome of many journeys, and I'm going to try to recapture in this lecture today what I learned in those journeys. But before that, I do want to mention that in terms of my own education, or should I say my intellectual journey, the larger subject of how the meanings of objects and of monuments and of phenomena in ancient India, ranging from emperors to particular events, are actually modified in the act of remembrance and commemoration. This is a subject which has long fascinated me. So, for many years, I have actually followed the variations between the histories in the construction of, let's say, images and monuments, and what would be considered as their reception histories. So, for instance, within religious practice, it's quite common to come across a bricolage of ancient and medieval times, which is reused and worshipped in a different form many centuries later. So I'm currently working in Bandhavgarh Tiger Reserve and doing jungle archaeology. And not far from there, the Tiger Reserve is what you see on the left, Kutiala. It's clearly a stupa, but which is today worshipped as a Devi Sthan. Lest you think that this only happens in villages, on the other side you have Ayodhya, where in the Nageshwar Nath temple you can see that it is an Ashokan pillar capital which forms the Gauri Patta on which the Shivalinga in the Nageshwar Nath temple is worshipped. So, when I look at Emperor Ashok's afterlife, uh, what I realize is that what I've discovered in the course of these travels actually complements the other work which I've been doing for a much longer period of time. But let's go on to the roads that lead to the remembrance of Ashok and see what are the new stories that emerge in and around that ancient king. So, the first thing that struck me was that Ashok was remembered across South Asia and beyond in ways which often had nothing to do with his historical presence there. So, the historical Ashok, in other words, was very different from the remembered emperor. Now, take the case of Junagarh. Normally, when you think of Junagarh, you think of the Girnar Parikrama around these magnificent peaks. It's important both for the Hindus and for the Jains. But much before their presence, on this stunning rock, and that's the building inside which the rock today is, you had the words of Emperor Ashok inscribed. They're actually the words of three emperors that have been inscribed there. Ashok in the 3rd century BC, Rudradaman who was a Shak ruler in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and after that, a Gupta ruler, that is Skandagupt in the 5th century CE. So it's like a book which has been written upon from the 3rd century till the 5th century. But if we were to listen to Ashok's voice at Girnar, and also at many other places where his major rock edicts are inscribed, you would realize that in these words, Ashok is asking his subjects to follow a moral path. His morality was very expansive. It ranged from non-violence towards human beings to non-violence towards animals. It involved proactive measures for providing nurture and medical care for them. And in these words, Ashok also fleshes himself out as all too human. He even tells us that, although he would like killing to stop in the royal kitchen, actually, even now, 2 peacocks and 1 deer continue to be cooked daily. And of course, in the most famous edict, which is here and elsewhere too, which is Edict 13, he describes the dimensions of the slaughter, the defeat, and the death and deportation that was a consequence of the Kalinga War. So, he has won the war, but he's snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, as it were. And as we know, that bloody triumph really concludes in a kind of remorse. So it is the challenges of governance and his own personal metamorphosis that is there in these words. Now, many centuries later, Emperor Ashok's name figures, and it figures in the words of Rudradaman. The Rudradaman inscription is on the back of this rock, and it has to do with repairs. So Rudradaman was actually overhauling and expanding a dam there and the Sudarshan Lake, as it was called, behind the dam. And rather unusually, he also decided to record that actually this dam was first created and renovated by the Mauryas. So there's a line in the Rudradaman inscription which tells us that the dam was first ordered to be made by the governor of Chandragupta, and that conduits were added to this by Emperor Ashoka. Remains of this dam have actually been found in Junagarh. You know, this soil that you see in front, that's very different from what you encounter elsewhere. And archaeologists see this as the remnants of the dam. And what I find really exceptional about the edict about this dam of Rudradaman is that quite, amazingly, unlike other rulers who never draw attention to the work of previous dynasts, here is King Rudradaman, who is allowing previous history to be squeezed into his own words. He's talking about what he has done, and there's a great deal of, blowing his own trumpet there. But even so, previous history is here. The other, I think, interesting thing is that actually this seems to be the only example that we have, or one of the only examples of Emperor Ashok having created something that was not a religious shrine or monument. But interestingly, Ashok himself, unlike Rudradaman, did not mention he did not mention his grandfather, Chandragupta, and he also didn't mention what he had added on to what his grandfather had first built there. So, how he was remembered at Junagarh over the centuries is actually very different from what he himself had recorded there. He chose to talk about new ideas of governance, the challenges that were involved in governing in a new way. He talked about Dhamma and so on and so forth, but he didn't think it was necessary to inform his subjects that he had also added on to this particular structure. So Ashok in Junagarh was remembered as a historical king who built a dam, who had renovated a dam built by his grandfather, but that was done by later rulers. It was not something that he chose to remember. Now, from Gujarat, if we move to Madhya Pradesh and to Sanchi, this is where we know that Emperor Ashok built a stupa. What you see here, of course, is the later cladding, which was added on in the time after Ashok. But inside this stupa, there is a brick core that constitutes the first stupa, which was built by this 3rd century BC emperor. And he put up a pillar next to it. The pillar is now broken, but you can clearly see on the right that there are words here, the words of Ashok in the Brahmi script and in the Prakrit language. The edict's message here is actually finger-waggingly stern. The ruler here, assumed this is addressed to the Buddhist Sangha, and he assumes the mantle of a spiritual regulator and a protector of Buddhist unity. And the monastic community, through his words at Sanchi, is warned that any nun or monk who would break up the Sangha would actually have to reside elsewhere, and that they would have to don white robes. White robes are a sign of a householder. So, the monarch is actually sounding like very papal here, I would say, a religious figure. And I imagine that the thought of wearing white robes would surely have put the fear of the Buddha in the minds of the Sangha. So, as far as the historical Ashok at Sanchi is concerned, he appears very much as an admonitory emperor. He, of course, built a big stupa, but he put up a pillar and he put up a message near that stupa, which was warning the Sangha about, what he saw as the schisms within it. Now, some centuries later, Ashok appears in the tapestry of Buddhist stories and events that are recorded at Sanchi. There are no identifying epigraphs which accompany these depictions, and the identifications that we have are actually worked out on the basis of, trying to marry the sculpture with the stories that are there in the Buddhist textual narratives. Ashok is most vividly shown on the richly carved gateway, which is the southern gateway of Sanchi. It is the main entrance into the great stupa, and this is not a coincidence. The southern gateway was the first to be set up because Ashok's pillar was there. So if you look at where the cursor is, this is the stump today of Ashok's pillar. And the gateway was made through a bequest by the ivory workers of Vidisha. Vidisha is a city that is just a few kilometers from Sanchi, and his beloved spouse, Ashok's beloved spouse, Devi, was supposed to be, who's the mother of Sangamitta and Mahinda, who will very soon, appear in this story. She was from Vidisha. Ironically enough, Devi is not shown on the gateway. It's another more colorful wife of the emperor, but about that, I'll just come to that in a minute. Now, there are two different stories on the gateway. One of them, which you see here, is Ashok's visit to the Ramagram Stoop. The stoop, in the middle there, is supposed to represent the Ramagram Stoop, although it resembles the Sanchi Stoop actually. This is what the mound of the Ramagram Stoop in Nepal looks like. According to the legendary biography of the emperor, which is called the Ashoka Avadan, which was written in the 2nd century of the Common Era, Ashok traveled to Ramagram to take possession of the Buddhist relics that were buried there. But he was completely unsuccessful. So if you see this particular panel, on the right, and this is Emperor Ashok here, who is on a chariot, you have the army of Ashok accompanying him to actually claim these relics. And on the other side, on the left, you have these Naga worshippers with their families. And, they are not shown as armed. These are hooded Naga worshippers. And they represent piety. And it is these Nagas who actually persuaded Ashok not to open that stupa. So the sculpted narrative actually juxtaposes military power represented by Ashok with the power of piety symbolized by the Nagas. Now, we don't generally associate Ashok with failure. His uncommon success as appearing to be a compassionate king, which is something that is even there in the textbooks today, accustoms us to seeing him as a victor. But the first of these two stories at the Sanchi Gateway remind us that in this instance, he actually failed to get what he was after. The second Ashoka story is carved on the same gateway's western pillar. It's the one which records his visit to the Bodhi tree. He looks very middle-aged, somewhat paunchy, decorated by a turban, a fly whisk, and all royal insignia of his imperial status. But the king actually looks positively weepy, ready to faint and to fall, and he's being stopped from keeling over by the women around him, including a queen who is supposed to be Tisha Rakshita. They're all supporting him. Now, the story, according to the Ashoka Avadan, is that the Bodhi tree was apparently withering because of the jealousy of Tisha Rakshita. Because Ashok used to keep speaking about Bodhi, she imagined that this was another woman. And she then got a sorceress to try to kill off the Bodhi tree. But when Ashok heard about this, and she said, I got this done, he said, you're just so ignorant because this is the Bodhi tree, this is not a woman. But the point is that here again, Emperor Ashok is far from triumphant. He's very much a figure of sorrow. So, when I began this, just spotting Ashok on embellishments around a stupa whose core he himself had actually built gave me a really good feeling because I said, well, look, he was remembered much after his time. I had set out in search of his afterlife, and I found these reincarnations in Sanchi. But as I began thinking more closely about it, it struck me that in Sanchi, many of the events that made Ashok great in my head weren't really to be found in this location. So, if you read the textual sources, forget his inscriptions, which are really an exceptionally humane form of governance, is embedded there. But even if you look at the textual sources, there are all these stories. So here is Emperor Ashok, who's supposed to have reopened many of the stupas in which the Buddha's relics were buried, and he is supposed to have redistributed these relics. But those are not stories that are shown at Sanchi. Similarly, in a previous life of Ashok, he was this young child called Jaya in the streets of Rajagriha, where the Buddha himself was begging. And what Jaya did was to put some dirt into the begging bowl of the Buddha. Now, whenever the Buddha received anything, he then asked the person to actually make a wish. So you have, this earlier avatar of Ashok, this child Jaya, saying that, he wanted to become a king and he wanted to spread the fame of the Buddha. And apparently, the Buddha prophesied that 100 years later, this boy would become the king of Pataliputra and, would be a great ruler. Now, this particular legend is actually there, shown in a sculpted frieze at Nagarajunkonda. But, you don't find such stuff here. So, I kept thinking about this while researching ancient Sanchi, and no satisfactory solution actually swum into my head in a manner of speaking. Why is it that he is represented in this way? Why would gateway carvings seek to highlight the fallibility of the emperor? So eventually, my explanation is this, that an emperor, even as devout as this, was still not ultimately the great being. He was not the Buddha who could actually overcome all variety of malevolence and misfortune. So, choosing to depict him in his fragility and deficiency was, I think, a way of showing the difference between the human and the divine. That is, the difference between Ashok and the Buddha. I think it was also a way of saying that, well, political power has its limits, and Ashok's power in particular has limits. So the point is that in his own lifetime, Emperor Ashok had shaped Sanchi in a particular way. He had delivered a very stern message to the Sangha. And I think many centuries later, the Sangha struck back. And instead of showcasing his power as an emperor, what was actually memorialized there was the limits of his influence. Now, from Madhya Pradesh, if we go south to Karnataka, to Kanaganahalli, uh, which is not far from Gulbarga, it's an amazing Buddhist site which today looks completely bombed out because no restoration, conservation work serious work has taken place there. Emperor Ashok's edicts are also found at Kanganahalli, but you already know what the major rocky dips are when I talked about Girnar, so I won't repeat that. If we were to look at his afterlife, so, there are all these sculptures which are lying on the ground. I hope they are no longer like this. I visited it some years ago. This was a site that was embellished during the time of the Satavahana rulers. And this is the founder of the Satavahana rulers, Chimuk Satavahana, with his wife. And there are many such portraitures, and they were all part of a stupa structure. So it's actually an absolutely unique Buddhist site. Now, along with all these Satavahana rulers, you also have Ashok. Uh, as at Sanchi, and this is Ashok with a crowd of women. He's always shown as at Sanchi with people. Uh, he's either, with his wives and other women in court, as in this case, or with a group of worshippers. Now, here, Emperor Ashok actually looks pretty slim and young in comparison to Sanchi. And this is later than Sanchi, it's second century of the Common Era. And I think it does explain why his queen here, the queen of Kanganahalli, is casting this very female gaze in his direction. But what is very interesting here is that he is wearing a holy thread across his chest. So the sculptor makes him out to be a Brahman, which is not how he was remembered. The caste symbol, I think, is perhaps explained by the sculptor's personal background or by local social compulsions. Ashok also, for the first time, is identified by name here. And you can see on the right a Brahmi inscription which reads as Raya Asoko. Now, as at Sanchi, you also have Ashok imagined in relation to the Bodhi tree. Uh, Here is Ashok as a worshipper at the Bodhi tree, and the throne below is supposed to symbolize the Buddha. Now, in the eighth rock edict of Ashok, Sambodhi or Mahabodhi, that was one of the ancient names for Mahabodhi, is mentioned as a place where the emperor journeyed to, and he proclaims his visit to Mahabodhi as being a life-changing one. So he tells us that previous kings used to take part and indulge in vihara yatras, that is pleasure tours, which are now being replaced by dhamma yatras, which are tours of morality, and that his tours of morality actually involve gifting not just to the Shramans, but also to the Brahmins, as well as providing support to aged people. Now, if you think about it, what Emperor Ashok's words, tell us about the historical emperor's engagement with Mahabodhi, it should have been eye candy for artists and sculptors, but it wasn't seen that way. So instead of that, you either have a grief-stricken king as at Sanchi, or you have a king as at Kanganahalli being shown as a royal devotee of the Bodhi tree. So the point I'm trying to make is that sculptural tableaus tell very tame stories as against the very compelling messaging of Ashok himself, who had seen his visit to Mahabodhi as being a transforming one. Uh, if you think about how memorialization has been looked at by historians all over the world, they often talk about the fact that there is a flat remembrance and a rounded remembrance. So I think this is actually a very flat remembrance of Ashok. The vitality that comes through when you read Ashok's words about Mahabodhi is simply not captured either at Sanchi or at Kanganahalli. Now, moving beyond India, there is Sri Lanka, where Ashok's remembrance is much more the remembrance of his children. That is Mahathera Mahinda and Mahatheri Sangamitta. The funny thing is that they don't figure in Ashok's own words. So they're not there in the inscriptions, but in the Deepa Vamsa and in the Mahavamsa, which are Sri Lankan chronicles, you have expansive descriptions of these two children. They are said to have arrived in Sri Lanka in the 3rd century BC. First Mahinda came and later Sangamitta. And both these were children of Ashok and Devi, the same Devi from Vidisha. So, if Ashok is writ large over the landscape of the Indian subcontinent, the siblings certainly overshadow their father in Lanka. But here, the treatment of the daughter of Ashok is different from that of the son. Now, Sanghamitta is supposed to have started off from the port of Tamralipti in Bengal. She boarded this big ship which brought her to the Jaffna coast to a place called Jambukola, which today is called Jambukola Patuna. The coastline actually appears pretty conducive to being, to providing natural harbors for ships. But she was there on the request of the Lanka king Devanam Piyatissa, whose wife Anula could only become a Buddhist renunciant if she was ordained by a bhikkhuni. And that's why Theri Sangamitta was going there. Mahinda, the brother, was already in Sri Lanka, and he requested his father that when his sister was coming, he should send with the sister the southern branch of the Bodhi tree. So, bearing the Bodhi branch in her vessel, Sangamitta, accompanied by the Buddhist community, embarked on this ship and she reached Jaffna. But the interesting thing is that, unlike the chapter which tells us about Mahinda's arrival, in the Mahavamsa, that is called the coming of Mahinda. But Sangamitta's arrival is described in a chapter titled The Coming of the Bodhi Tree. So the entire narrative is actually focused on the king of men, that is the Lankan king Devanam Piyatissa, receiving from her the king of the trees, with Sangamitta there as a kind, you can see her here holding the Bodhi tree. She's a kind of necessary appendage to the Bodhi tree branch. Now, at Jambukola Patuna, although the Mahavamsa mentions that a temple was made by Devanam Piyatissa, there is actually nothing ancient at the moment. There are only modern fabrications. You have a large number of statues of Sangamitta, some of which show you how she may have arrived. So there's a replica of a boat there, and Sangamitta is, on the left. And you also have a stupa there, which has these elephants made on it in order to replicate the Pulanaruva stupa in Sri Lanka. So to give it a kind of antiquity, but it is entirely modern. So the challenge for me really was, what then are the visible markers of Buddhism, early Buddhism in Jaffna? After all, if a story is composed, there ought to be something there. So, in the Jaffna region, there are actually some Buddhist remains which provide a kind of historical frame for her arrival. One of these is from the Vallipuram Vishnu temple area. Now, this Gopuram, of course, is a modern creation. It's a very interesting Gopuram. Not merely because of its connections with South India and the fact that it has Vishnu avatars and apsaras and all kinds of characters on it. It's the only Gopuram I have ever seen which also has a statue of Gandhi on it. So, Gandhi on a Gopuram is really rare. And to make sure that people know it's Gandhi, he's got the national flag of India draped around his shoulders. This Gopuram was completed in 1990, and that was, the height of the Civil War. And I'd like to think that whoever designed this wanted to put a man of peace, for people to remember this in a time of terrible strife. Now, this particular spot, the Vallipuram Vishnu area, has actually yielded a gold plaque. This gold plaque that you see here is in the Colombo National Museum. Its language is Prakrit, and it speaks of a Buddhist temple there, a temple called Pianguka, and later this temple came to have images. A stone Buddha was actually unearthed very close to the temple. There are also stupas on the suburbs of Jaffna at a place called Kantaradai. Here, apart from the stupa, you have a very large mound which has yielded silver punch-marked coins, which are dated to the late centuries BC and are the sort that you see in South India. And of course, below the stupas that you see here, there is also a pre-Buddhist megalithic culture. So the fact that Jaffna has great history, ancient history, must have been known to the composer of the, Mahavansa, as he put down the story of Sanghamitta coming from Jaffna. And she, of course, eventually, very soon, went with the king to Anuradhapura, which is much more central Sri Lanka. And that is where even today, the Bodhi tree, which is apparently from the sapling that she carried, is a major object of worship. Now, beyond the tale of Sanghamitta coming from India and settling at Anuradhapura, coming by ship, it is her brother Mahinda who dominates the Buddhist stories here. Now, he, along with his fellow monks, actually came, apparently, according to the Mahavansa, by the aerial route. And he was following the example of the Buddha, who himself had flown there and alighted at Sri Lanka, but of course could not convert the island. This all reminds us, of course, of the legend of Hanuman in the Ramayana. But Mahinda is supposed to have alighted at the Mihintile mountain on this particular peak, Silakutta. It's a northern peak of Mahintile. Mahintile is actually only 15 kilometers from Anuradhapura, and later Mahinda would go there. But at this point, you have King Devanam on a hunting expedition there, where he's going after an elk stag, and he then comes face to face with this group of Shramanas. Once he realizes that this is the son of Ashok, he then puts down his bow and arrow, and eventually on that very day he's converted by Mahinda, as are 40,000 of his followers. And miraculously, Dhamma is preached across Sri Lanka from Mahintale itself. Now, there's a religious landscape at Mahintale which actually evokes Mahinda. This is the Mahindu Seya, where a part of the relics of Mahinda were enshrined. And then, of course, the building has been renovated over time. But there is an early Brahmi inscription here. Now, although Mahinda lived in Anuradhapura during the rainy season, as the texts will always tell you, monks then went and lived away from habitations, especially cities. So, Devanampiya Tissa's successor built a large number of rock-cut caves for the Buddhists there. And this is supposed to be the cave, and this is supposed to be the bed where, which was used by Mahinda. So there is this religious landscape both here and at Anuradhapura, which evokes Ashok's son. Now, Sri Lanka, of course, has, if you look at what is on the ground, this is what is the legend, this is what is there in the Mahavansa. It actually has something broader. It has a many layered patronage history of Buddhism on the ground, which is very different from the textual tradition. So, the great scholar of Sri Lanka, Senarath Paranivitane's study of the inscriptions, and 1,000 inscriptions found, on the drip ledges of various caves, as you can see here, reveals the names of treasurers of a variety of chiefs, royal physicians, teachers, gamikas, craftsmen, all of them are mentioned as patrons of Buddhism. But in the textual tradition, uh, the tale of the establishment of Buddhism is a right royal saga in which there are two kings, one Sri Lankan and the other Indian, and the children of the Indian king share the honors. And the indisputable fact is that it is this chronicled image of Ashoka, the one that is developed in the Sri Lankan chronicles, that becomes immensely influential in the ensuing centuries. In fact, it was in his Mahavansa incarnation that Emperor Ashok journeyed across to Southeast Asia, and that's where I continued my chase or search for Ashok. So let's, go to Myanmar first and then to Thailand. Myanmar, incidentally, has a large number of stupas, pagodas as they are called there, uh, which were renovated by medieval emperors. That's what the inscriptions say, but were originally built by Emperor Ashok. They're found in Bagan, but they are found elsewhere too. And this notwithstanding the fact that Ashok himself never alluded to anything in Southeast Asia, not even in a generic sense. So, the term Suvarnadeep, for instance, doesn't occur in his inscriptions, and it's only lands to the west of his empire that actually figure. But as I said right at the beginning, remembrance can often have very little to do with the historical persona. Now, of all that is remembered about Ashok in Myanmar, for me the most fascinating is what you see in a temple in Bagan. This is the temple. It's in the Minkaba area, the Gubyaki temple. This was a temple that was set up by the son of the third king in a dynasty that was inaugurated by King Anaratha or Anuruddha, as he is sometimes called. Uh, the, uh, the man is Rajakumar who built this temple, and he was the son of King Kyanzitta. King Kyanzitta had actually been a general in the army of Anaratha, but because of a whole lot of problems at his ascension, he had promised that it would be the heir to the, his heir would be the offspring of his daughter from a Mon prince who had actually helped him in ascending the throne of the kingdom that was based in Bagan. So Rajakumar, who actually built this temple, knew fully well that he would never become king. Now, Rajakumar, for that reason, then became a remarkable scholar. And if you look at the temple that he made, it's full of paintings, paintings of the Buddhist Jataks, scenes from the life of the Buddha, also a large number of representations of Emperor Ashok. So I think what Rajkumar tried to do was to master the full range of Theravada cosmology and literature, and to show off his knowledge through the paintings and through the inscriptions that were added on the glosses on the paintings that tell us what they are. He tried to provide a picture of world history as it appeared to the Buddhists of those days, and that's why India and Sri Lanka figure here, as does Myanmar. And of course, that's why Ashok figures here as well. Of course, what Rajkumar tried to do was to engage with the text but drop those parts which didn't interest him and add bits that actually made the story more personal. So he brought the Buddhist story inside this temple to the time of King Anuruddha, who his father had served. And he also brought in a Sinhalese king who was a friend of Anuruddha, Vijay Bahu, who had died around the time when this temple was built. Now, to just give you a sense of what is it about Emperor Ashok that is put up here. So you have paintings like this. It's not a it's a terrible photograph, but you're not allowed to photograph. And this was sent to me by somebody else, uh, by actually an Indian who has helped in the conservation of Bagan called Amalesh Roy, who's now completely Burmese, speaks the language, wears a lungi, and of course has really helped in preserving Bagan. So this is supposed to be, the figure in the middle is supposed to be Mogali Putta Tissa. And here below, this guy with a beard and a crown, this is Emperor Ashok. So here is, Mogali Putta Tissa, who is actually performing miracles for Emperor Ashok. There is one more painting that I have here, where Ashok is actually telling his ministers to hold the Uposatha festival. So again, it is Mogali Putta Tissa who dominates the frame. There are other paintings as well. This is about the third Buddhist council, which was held in Pataliputra in the time of Ashok. But you have other paintings which show and inscriptions which show Ashok's engagement with the Sri Lankan king. It's called the island of Singhala, and Devanam Piyatissa is said to be reigning there, and it's said that King Dhamma Ashok sent him the ornaments of sovereignty. Actually, the second consecration of Devanam Piyatissa happened in the way in which Ashok wanted, according to the Mahavansa. There's another panel concerning the time when King Dhamma Ashok sent the relic of the tree with Theri Sangamitra to Lanka. So the point is that if you look at the interior of the temple, there's a lot of South Asia there. But I think what is far more important is the agenda of Rajkumar. That is, that through the temple, Rajkumar is actually making his own knowledge and mastery of the texts explicit, and therefore, even though he can't become king, he's immortalizing himself for posterity through, another form. So, what I'm trying to say is that it's one thing to spot Emperor Ashok in all these paintings, but if you look at everything taken together and the political circumstances in which this temple was made, the story then becomes much more the story of, a Bagan prince rather than an Emperor Ashok. Now, as we move to Thailand, a different pastiche of memorialization can be seen there. In fact, when I began my work in Thailand, I now look back and see it as being really, retrospectively speaking, very simplistic. So there were all these places in Thailand where the name of Asok could be encountered. So if you go to Sukhumvit, in Bangkok, you actually have a street there which is called Soi Asok. but it isn't our Ashok. It's actually Asok Montri. It was a minister of, Thailand, after whom it's named. You have this vegetarian sect there called Shanti Asok, which participated most famously in the anti-government protests that led to storming of Bangkok's international airport many years ago. But there are other things. Uh, you know, there are chronicles like the Chiang Mai Chronicle, where you have Tilokrat, a ruler of Thailand, desiring to be like Ashok. And there's another king who, when he is being consecrated, wants to be consecrated in a way that he could subdue continents like King Ashok. But I think when you look at the chronicles, the most spectacular integration and modification of the historical Ashok uh, can actually be seen in remembrances in South Thailand, in a place called Nakhon Si Thammarat. And around, the chronicles are built around this spot which is called Wat Mahatat. Now, Nakhon Si Thammarat was a place where there was a line of kings ruling from the 12th to the 13th, end of the 13th century, who called themselves Sri Dhamma Sokorat, which is Sri Dhamma Ashoka Raja. And their base is called Nakhon Si Thammarat, that is the city of Dhammaraja. So, Ashok is invoked in many ways in Nakhon Si Thammarat in the historical area. But if you look at the chronicle around Nakhon Si Thammarat, that actually tells you some very interesting stories. It talks about the relics which are enshrined in Wat Mahatat, the fact that they came from a city in India, a city called Dantapuri or Nagarapuri, and these were brought here by, you know, this brother and sister who you see here, modern statues of them, Hemjala and Dandakumar. Uh, they had been attacked, the Kosh Raja, who was their father, had been attacked because of the holy relics. And these two ran away with, Himajala actually wrapping her hair around the relics. It so happened that the boat that they were in capsized. They then reached a forest, and then from a forest, they reached a beach, a crystalline beach, which is where Wat Mahatat is. And they were there for a while until a Thera arrived, a Buddhist monk, and told them that they should go to Sri Lanka, which is where they were originally headed for. So they eventually arrive after several mishaps in Sri Lanka, where the relic is worshipped. And then the king of Sri Lanka divides the relics into two parts, one of which is sent back to Dantapuri, and the other is brought back to Nakhon Si Thammarat, where it is buried. So this is, one story. And when you think about it and you think, well, it somehow reminds you of the Ashokan stories of relics being rescued and redistributed. Of course, Ashok legendarily is supposed to have built 84,000 stupas, and this is a story of one stupa, but still there are elements that are common. But very soon, as you start reading this chronicle, you realize that there is a twist in the story. And the twist is this, that the Indian Ashok is shown vis-a-vis the, the Thai Ashok as being a supplicant for relics. Now, Ashok is the one who redistributed relics, but according to the Nakhon Si Thammarat chronicle, uh, it was, the king of South Thailand who received a letter from the ruler of the middle country, Madhya Desh, whose name was Sri Dhamma Ashok Raja. He was a man of immense merit. He had erected 84,000 reliquaries. He knew the principles of Buddhism. He could translate from Pali as well as the monks. But the tragedy was that he had built these reliquaries, but there were no relics to enshrine. So he was now requesting the Dhamma Ashok Raja of South Thailand to provide him with some relics to enshrine. Now, it was very embarrassing for the Thai Ashok because he actually didn't know exactly where the relics were buried. But there was this 100-year-old man who came forward and identified the place. So these were got out, and then some of them were sent to Ashok in India. Now, the Buddhist chronicles of South Asia usually credit Ashok and elsewhere too with redistributing the Buddha's bones and building stupas over them. But from this story, what you realize is that there's a very neat reversal. And it is the Indian Ashok who is now beholden to his Thai namesake. So it's the Thai Ashok who is the custodian of the relics. He's the custodian of sacred power, the power that was so desperately sought by the Indian Ashok. So the whole point is that cultures interact with each other, but they pluck out symbols and beliefs, and they build stories which are very different from stories that this is a medieval story from an ancient story that is there both in the Sri Lankan chronicles and in the Ashok Avadan. Now, of course, Thailand has many other elements that remind us of Ashok. For example, from the 6th century onwards, you have these large dharma chakras that are made. Dharma chakras which used to crown pillars, very much, in the Ashokan tradition. So it's a form that actually reminds us of the Sarnath pillar. You have a pillar, and originally on that you had a Dharma Chakra. But if you start going into the details, there's something very different. Here, there are carvings on the Dharma Chakra, which were not there in the surviving pieces of the Sarnath Dharma Chakra. You also have texts which have been written both on the hub and on the spokes of the Dharma Chakra. So, for example, in Nakhon Pathom, which is the heart of the culture that produced these Dharma Chakras, the Dwaravati culture, and Dwaravati is, by the way, named after Dwarka. In India, why it was called Dwaravati, is something that seems, odd, but that's it. This is what it's all about. When you look at culture, it's a hybrid mix. Now, one of the Dharma Chakras I saw there had the 4 noble truths of the Buddha inscribed on it. And this is perfectly in order because it was at his first sermon in Sarnath that the Buddha, with the turning of the wheel, which is the Dharma Chakra, recited the 4 noble truths. So, this is it, that again and again you are finding something that is completely Indian in its inspiration. But when it comes to the details, it is completely different. So, when cultures have commerce with each other in this way, a cultural commerce, this is what emerges. It's never a straightforward story. In fact, it's never a straightforward story, even in India. And talking of the Sarnath pillar capital and the Dharma Chakra that used to be on it, reminds me of Jawaharlal Nehru, who in the debate on the Ashokan flag had this to say: the Ashokan wheel in the Indian flag was something which all of us have seen, the one on the top of the capital of the Ashokan column and in many other places. That wheel is a symbol of India's ancient culture. It's a symbol of many things that India has stood for in the ages. Now, the funny thing is that neither Nehru nor any modern Indian has ever seen the Dharma Chakra on the Sarnath pillar capital because when it was excavated, only fragments were found. So, when Nehru says that all of us have seen this on top of the capital of the Ashokan column, he imagines because it was there, they've seen it, but it's actually not there. He also sees this, which is a completely Buddhist symbol, as he puts it, as a symbol of all that India has stood for in the ages. And by the way, a few years after that, you had a historian, Vasudev Sharan Agrawal, who in a book called Chakra Dhwaja said that the Dharma Chakra was not a sectarian concept, but the fruit of a number of religious, philosophical, and cult motives which received universal approval for thousands of years in the accumulated tradition of Indian people. The point, however, is that on the Sarnath pillar, it is very much a symbol of Buddhism. It is not a general symbol. So, in the remembrance of Ashok in relation to the Sarnath pillar, what Nehru and later Vasudev Sharan Agrawal do is to make that piece of sculpture more inclusive. That is, something which was very exclusive is now become something that can include a lot of people. So I would say this is a kind of rounded remembrance, but this is not the only kind of remembrance you have in India. And, I want to show you my last slide, which is from Patna some years ago, where you can see a mustachioed Ashok on the left, very muscular. He is considered to be a Kushwaha, a backward, other backward caste in Bihar, and he surfaces on posters every time there is an election in Bihar. Now, considering that Ashok himself was least interested in his own background, forget his family, his Varna background, none of that actually figures in his inscription. And he was the third ruler in the Maurya dynasty. He led a pretty cushy life as a prince. So there's nothing backward and handicapped about the man. But here he is, a symbol of Kushwaha culture and Kushwaha pride. I want to end this lecture by just showing you a small clip, which is for me the most recent remembrance of Ashok. It's part of the Edict project, which the wonderful vocalist T.M. Krishna is doing with Ashoka University, where he has actually given the epigraphic voice of Ashok, which is in prose. He has set it to song. And he has very carefully chosen the edicts to highlight particular elements of Ashok. So if you were to ask yourselves that, well, why is T.M. Krishna doing it? He tells us that he is doing this because of the steady erosion, even the obliteration of a humane and enlightened form of governance, which has a genealogy that goes back to Ashok and continued into the Nehruvian era and later. So his engagement with Ashok is coming out of a more contemporary anguish. So I'm just going to show you that short clip.